approaching our final destination, Itchy and Scratchy Land, the amusement park of the future where nothing can possibly go wrong. Possibly go wrong. That's the first thing that's ever gone wrong.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Springfield Googleplex, the movie podcast for Simpsons fans, brought to you by thatshelf.com. Each week, we talk about a movie parodied on The Simpsons. Maybe it was The Simpsons that introduced us to the film. Or maybe when we finally saw it, we realized, well, hey, that's where that Simpson joke came from. Regardless, each week we pick one that one of us hasn't seen or hasn't seen in a while, watch it, and come together to discuss. I'm your host, Adam Scholes, and joining me as always is the gunslinger to my chief supervisor, my co-host, Nate Story. How are you doing today, buddy?
I'm doing pretty well. This is our first recording sesh since the new year, so I'm very excited about another Happy New Year. I'm excited for just another year of diving into these movies parodied on The Simpsons.
Well, and to that end, this week, we watched Michael Crichton's Westworld from 1973. You might remember it from such Simpson episodes as Season 5's The Boy Who Knew Too Much, and Season 6's Itchy and Scratchy Land, which I have to say is probably, I've said this a couple times on the show, but probably a top 5, certainly a top 10 favorite episode for me.
Yeah. Oh, no, it's an amazing episode. And I think one of the interesting commonalities about the only 2 episodes where this is parodied is that they were both under showrunner David Merkin, who on the commentary points out that he loves this movie.
Okay.
So
interesting.
Yeah. He may have been the influence that brought this movie into The Simpsons.
Right. Well, that would make a lot of sense. So, I guess that sort of emphasizes that tonight we're going to be talking about Itchy and Scratchy Land, Season 6, Episode 4. Original air date, October 2nd, 1994, which means this episode is, believe it or not, 30 years old, which is kind of crazy to put into perspective. But, I guess when the show's been on as long as it has, that makes a lot of sense. Written by the great John Swartzwelder and directed by Wes Archer, who, if memory serves from when I used to watch the DVDs with all the commentaries, he's directed a number of my favorite episodes. So I think he's a pretty talented guy. Now, before we get into this, though, Nate, we haven't ever really dug too deep into Itchy and Scratchy on our show.
No.
How do you feel about the Itchy and Scratchy series? I don't even really know how to describe it, but the show
cinematic universe.
Show, the Itchy and Scratchy cinematic universe. I like that. Yeah. What are your thoughts and feelings? Do you like it? Do you hate it?
Weirdly, I think I appreciate it more now than when I was younger, which is maybe surprising because it's kind of the most obviously slapsticky, funny sort of thing. But I think watching The Simpsons, it wasn't the reason I watched The Simpsons. You know what I mean? And so I kind of was just whatever. It's almost like filler. Sometimes there's some funny gags, sometimes not. But now that I'm older, I think I get more what it's trying to do. It's a parody of Tom and Jerry, right? Or even the Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote. It's that kind of formula, but it's just taking
with the violence cranked up to 11. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Where it's actually almost showing the consequences of the violence in those same cartoons that are incredibly violent often, but playing up the gore a little bit to kind of make a point. And so there's that part of it, which I kind of appreciate more now, what it's playing off of, the cartoons that I watched when I was a kid that were reruns at that point. And then the other thing that I love about it is the writers and the animators use it as a way to talk about their own work and the industry as a whole, kind of in the same way that they use Krusty the Clown to talk about show business and that kind of stuff too.
Right.
There's Itchy and Scratchy and Marge, right, where they're sort of digging more into how the cartoon gets made and stuff like that. And there's even this episode. So one of the interesting things about the origin of this episode is that it was a response to censorship.
Right.
Basically, the writers were getting really worked up about, the sort of political conversation that was going on at the time in 94 and the way that Fox was also responding to it, where they were sort of kowtowing and saying, oh, we need to tone it down. They basically said to them, you need to stop using Itchy and Scratchy so much, and it can't be as extreme as it used to be. And so they wanted to actually, of course, in classic Simpsons fashion, turn up the dial on that and see how far they could push it. And so they decided to do an entire episode about Itchy and Scratchy where they go to this theme park with the explicit reason that it's you can immerse yourself in violence, basically.
Yeah.
That's what I appreciate about it, I guess, is the way that they use it to tell other stories throughout the cartoon. But what about you? What are your thoughts on Itchy and Scratchy?
Yeah, no, I mean, again, much like you, when I was a kid, I probably just saw it as like, oh, it's this goofy, slapsticky, like hyper-violent version of Bugs Bunny or Tom and Jerry or these various other cartoons that existed at the time. But as I got older, then I started to, like you say, I appreciate that it was actually like, it was really, at the end of the day, like it's arguably some of the like most satirical stuff on the show, because it's really playing up this idea of cartoon violence. And it's also often used as a way to poke fun at Walt Disney and the Disney Corporation, which of course is now all the more ironic because they're now owned by Disney.
Right.
And I think part of it too is that this also was a great way for them to just randomly throw in a movie parody that they wanted to do that otherwise wouldn't make sense. And, you know, we've talked a little bit about The Critic and how Al Jean and Mike Reiss basically said, like, we loved writing movie parodies on The Simpsons, so we thought, how do we come up with a show where that's just what we can do 24/7? And I love that show as a result. But yeah, a lot of these movie parodies and some of our favorites, I when we were in high school, we used to always reference that scene in Pulp Fiction where he dances to Stuck in the Middle with You and cuts off his ear, which of course is parodied on The Simpsons via Itchy and Scratchy, because there's no other way you could do that on The Simpsons. So over the years, as they started doing them less and less, I can't say that I missed its presence, but as an adult revisiting them, they do make me chuckle just because of the sheer absurdity of the violence and some of the horrible, horrible ways Itchy destroys Scratchy really does make me laugh. So yeah, it's I wouldn't say I have a love-hate relationship or anything like that, or that like, oh, it's my favorite part of the show. And I know there are certain people who do like absolutely love it, but I appreciate it for what it is. And I guess in a way, I'm also glad that The Simpsons were able to move beyond that as time went on, as they found their voice in a sense and no longer needed to use Itchy and Scratchy as a means to talk about what they wanted to talk about.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's a whole like university dissertation that could be written about Itchy and Scratchy's place within the Simpsons universe, but
totally. For at least the first many seasons, they tried to have like one episode every season that kind of focused on Itchy and Scratchy.
Yeah.
And find some way to extend it, whether it's the movie or a controversy or, you know, Itchy and Scratchy Land.
One of the things I love about this episode is that, again, Itchy and Scratchy are used as a vehicle for multiple parodies. Like, obviously, we have the main Westworld parody, but you also get the Fantasia parody and the Pinocchio parody. And like I said, the sort of like this idea of Walt Disney and his relationship to, you know, politics and popular culture. Like, so it's just, I love that they're able
anti-Semitism.
Yeah, well, exactly. But yeah, like that's what I mean. Like, I think if there's something that they want to talk about that they can't find a natural way to do it, then they can just do it through Itchy and Scratchy.
Right.
I think that's a brilliant sort of writing trick that they can do that and it never feels out of place. It's never one of those things that you're like, where is this coming from?
But on the other hand, like this episode also manages to cram in so many movie parodies and references that have like nothing to do with Itchy and Scratchy.
Oh yeah, no, exactly.
These are the seasons where they're just weaving them in back to back, where it's like, not only did they have Westworld and Jurassic Park, which are kind of the main big ones, they reference Last Action Hero, Witness, which is a great movie that I don't think anyone sees anymore, but it's an awesome movie. Jaws, The Birds, Saturday Night Fever, like Gremlins. Yeah, they managed to get a lot of stuff in here and just weave it together very naturally. So I love this episode. I think it's fantastic.
Before we get into the parody stuff, there's also just like so many great lines in this episode, including probably my most quoted line in real life. Every time we park somewhere where we have to sort of remember where we parked, you know, we're going to IKEA or we're downtown Toronto and we're parking underground or whatever, I always say, remember where we parked? We're in the itchy lot. And my wife just gives me a look of like, what? Like, what are you talking about? Like, nobody ever gets it, but I always have to say it because I think it's so funny. But
yeah. Totally. It gets at one of those sort of observational truths. You know, whenever we park at the airport, that's exactly what it feels like, where it's like, oh, good, we're in the E section along with like 2,000 other cars, you know, like it's impossible to find.
It's funny because we got a season's pass to the zoo the last 2 years, and the parking lot is, they have the elephant section and the anteater section
Right.
and the like beluga whale section. That's where it mostly comes to mind, especially of just like, oh, I'm supposed to remember what random animal section I'm in, as if like there's any way to keep that in my brain.
Totally. I think more than anything, this is really a parody of Disneyland, right?
Right.
I think that's sort of where this idea started, was they wanted to like, you know, poke these sensors in the eye. And they were like, okay, how do we do that? Well, let's do like an Itchy and Scratchy theme park. And all of the writers often talk about their relationship to Disney movies, but also Disneyland, because of course, you know, that's where they are. They've been there many times. They know it super well. Comes up in lots and lots of episodes. But this has all sorts of references to Disneyland. You know, the parking being one of them. They have like the Disney Bucks joke. They have like Splash Mountain. They have, you know, the Roger Myers story, like all of those things.
Euro
Disney.
Itchy and Scratchy Land. Yeah. I love that bit at the end. My children need wine.
Yeah, exactly. And like one of the more obscure ones is the Electric Light Parade. Do you know what that is?
So I never saw the Electric Light Parade, but it was like one of those things where I guess it would have been like those early years of Disneyland where it was like a big thing. Like my dad talked about it being a big thing. I went to Disneyland for the first time when I was probably like 4 or 5, so I don't really remember most of it. But that would have been it would have been the early 90s, like Disney Renaissance era. Aladdin had just come out. Like that was the big thing that was all over the park, was all the Aladdin stuff. So it was kind of when the park was undergoing a very big sort of change, and some of those things were being phased out or modified or, you know, taken in a new direction, which they constantly are doing. Is the Electric Light Parade still even a thing? Like,
so I'd been to Disney World when I was like probably 6 years old or something like that, but I'd never been to Disneyland before until I think it was last year.
Okay.
COVID brain, so I don't remember what year it was. But
time has no meaning anymore. But
since COVID, and we went to Disneyland with my in-laws who love Disneyland. They are in California and have been there many, many times. So they're sort of like the experts that you want to go with. And when we went, they were getting ready to revive the Electric Light Parade and the fireworks display.
Okay.
So we were there the week before they were going to launch it officially, but they tested it out while we were there.
Okay.
And so we got to see basically the dress rehearsal, which was great because the crowds weren't as bad. And the Electric Light Parade's pretty lame.
Because for those who aren't familiar, it's just like a bunch of neon like floats, right? Like it's not, it's nothing to write home
happens
about.
At night. Has a very annoying song, which is replicated very well in The Simpsons.
So.
Yeah, it's very repetitive though. It's like it's just like on loop, and with these like slow moving neon floats and stuff. So it was kind of funny that they still continue to celebrate that. But you know, the fireworks display was ace.
Yeah,
that was pretty incredible.
It is kind of interesting though that they chose Itchy and Scratchy, and I'm sure, like you say, it's because the in-universe history of Itchy and Scratchy is based on Disney, and they've already sort of established that. But you know, Krusty is sort of the character that has like all the merchandise and is sort of the sellout. And in a weird way, you almost expect like Krusty Land would have been the place that they would go. So it's interesting that they chose Itchy and Scratchy, but knowing that it's because they really wanted to just saturate the episode with violence, it sort of seems like that's why they're like, okay, well, let's do a Disneyland parody and we'll use Itchy and Scratchy and we can just like amp up the violence to an absurd degree. I mean, I love the scene where they're in the diner and they're all placing their orders and Marge is like horribly offended by everything. And then
I'll have the baby guts.
You disgust me. Mom, that's veal. Which is just like, again, it's like,
it's so funny too.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a perfect Simpsons moment, but why Westworld, dude? Like, that's my question. It's like, why Westworld?
So I think this is the sort of train of thought, right? Is like, okay, we want to amp up the violence. Okay, how do we do that? We do that with a theme park.
Right.
So they have that idea, and then they're like, okay, we have a setting, but what's the story? Right? Like, what actually goes wrong? So act one, they want to go, and then they go. And then they get there, and then what happens, right? And so I think that that's really what it boils down to, is they were sort of like, okay, you know, like the robots go haywire. Oh yeah, like that movie Westworld. Like that seems to be kind of the train of thought, is like, as soon as you do that and you're thinking about theme parks, well, immediately you're going to think of Michael Crichton, because he has not one, but 2 movies that are about theme parks going awry. Both Westworld and Jurassic Park written by Michael Crichton. But interestingly, of course, Westworld is actually directed by Michael Crichton as well.
Right, yeah.
Whereas, of course, Jurassic Park is our friend Steven Spielberg. So, yeah, the main parts that are actually parodies of Westworld are, of course, like the robots going haywire, right?
Yep.
That sort of originates with this movie in a lot of ways. But then also all of the sort of areas that are under the theme park where they're like repairing robots, and they have a control center where they're like being like, we're out of Bort license plates. Like all of that stuff is really taken from this movie as well.
Yeah, because not to interrupt, but you brought it up, so now I have to mention it. As someone who has a Bort license plate keychain, and Bort has become one of my favorite running gags.
Bort? Oh, come on, Bort?
Mommy, buy me a license plate!
No, come along, Bort.
Are you talking to me?
No, my son is also named Bort.
In fact, our show, when we had to register with like Apple Podcasts or whatever, we needed to come with like a production company. So I'm pretty sure our production company is called Also Named Bort Productions.
Indeed.
And of course,
Excuse
if you
me?
go, my cousin who's been to the Simpsons land at Universal Studios, which is, the snake is eating its tail. But if you go to Simpsons Land, they have personalized license plates that you can buy, and the gift shop is perpetually out of Bort license plates. You can't get one, which is just a
Just
which
like
is a
the
nice,
episode.
Yeah, which is a nice little touch. So
There you go.
We need more Bort license plates in the gift shop. I repeat, we are sold out of Bort license plates.
But yeah, like you get the underground stuff. You get the they remove the face of the robots, much like that shot in Westworld.
I really wish they wouldn't scream.
It's funny because you made this point in the Day of the Dolphin episode of like, if you're going to do a parody of Crazy Dolphins, you have to talk about Day of the Dolphin. This is one of those ones where I'm like, where you say like, oh, well, when you talk about a theme park gone awry, you got to talk about Westworld. And I have to wonder, like, do you? And we're going to get into this because, like, was Westworld that well known? Like, it's funny because now there's the HBO TV series. So, like, I think it's more in the popular culture than it maybe was.
Right.
But, like, when this episode came out 30 years ago, was Westworld that well known? We're going to get into it. Or is this just, like, again, the movie nerds at The Simpsons sort of flexing their trivia? I don't know.
So, without spoiling too much, I think the short answer to that is this is a cult hit, right?
Okay.
It was popular at the time, but I think that there's like appreciation among a very specific group of people that happen to be very influential. And so it has this weirdly long tail, but not in a popular way. This is like part of that long tail.
And certainly Michael Crichton has a remarkable career. Jurassic Park, obviously, but like the thing that everybody sort of forgets is a Michael Crichton property. ER, like one of the most successful dramatic television series of the 90s, is a Michael Crichton show. Well, okay, so maybe, is there anything else you want to say about the episode, or should we jump into the movie? Because I feel like this is a good sort of like jumping off point to actually talk about the movie. So
I think we have to, because I really could just keep talking about this episode forever, because I think there are so many funny gags in this, but we should dig into the movie itself. So on that note, Adam, how would you sum this movie up in a sentence as the newbie?
This one's pretty easy. Guy goes on vacation at theme park, and it goes badly when the robots go awry.
Sure.
Basically.
That's fair.
It's a pretty simple plot, a pretty simple movie, honestly.
Yeah, it really is. There isn't actually a lot of plot to this at all.
And I have to say, it's funny because one of my notes is like, I paused the movie because I had to go to the bathroom, and I was about halfway through, and I'm like, is anything gonna happen? Because like it literally, we were at the halfway point, and I was like, I've seen the parody, and I like know I know where this is going, but like nothing's happened yet, And apart from just like we're seeing these people interact in this crazy universe. So, and sure enough, like within like 5 or 10 minutes of me thinking that, that's when it really does kick off and you get into the chase, as it were. But yeah, it's a very, very simple premise. And I kind of appreciate that. I've talked a lot about my appreciation for simple ideas well executed. And I think this definitely would fall into that category. So,
I mean, like Jurassic Park is also parodied in the Simpsons episode, right?
And couldn't be more different in terms of scope and scale. Like when comparing Jurassic Park to Westworld, like
but at the same time, like they feel very different, mostly because the movie making in
that's what I mean.
Jurassic
like in terms of the scope and scale of this film, like Jurassic Park is this massive blockbuster, and Westworld feels almost like an indie movie in a way.
Yeah, totally. But the thing that's interesting, I think, is that when you really strip away all of the extras on Jurassic Park, it's the same plot, and it is just as simple. It's really just as simple. There is a theme park with dinosaurs. People go there expecting a good time, and it goes badly. That's it. That's the whole plot.
The biggest difference between the two is that Jurassic Park sort of deals with the existential idea of like, should we or should we not do this? Which Westworld completely avoids. In fact, one of my notes that I said was that I kind of like that the film doesn't really address why the robots are malfunctioning, how the robots are malfunctioning.
Only very briefly. Yeah.
Like it kind of glosses over that. And I really appreciate that. It just sort of lets it be. To me, that's the difference between the two movies, is that it's A, the scope and scale, and then B, obviously Jurassic Park digs into this sort of like
chaos theory.
Exactly.
All that stuff.
The Ian Malcolm of it all. But
right. But like that's the interesting thing too, is like in a lot of ways, this feels like a rough draft for Jurassic Park, where Jurassic Park has all the bells and whistles. It has amazing set pieces, but it also has the philosophy, both of which are kind of missing from this movie. But there's still also some pretty ambitious things in here. Again, like you said, on a more indie scale. It's not like big flashy stuff, but there's some weird stuff in here, which we'll dig into.
So, Nate, what is your background with this movie? Because I had never seen it before. You had sort of like picked it, and I was excited. This has been on my watch list for years, but you had seen it before, correct?
Yeah, so I had seen it before. And again, there are a lot of movies that I kind of forget exactly when I saw them.
Right.
This is one of those. But there was sort of a phase that I went through where I watched all of these old 1970s sci-fi movies, like this, Logan's Run, Silent Running, all of these movies that are, kind of influential, but also like really of the era, feel very dated, hadn't been remade at the time.
Well, and not for lack of trying with Logan's Run. Every few years that they announce that it's finally going to be remade, and then it kind of disappears.
So weird. Such a weird idea to remake that movie. But, actually, now it's coming back to me. I think I watched Logan's Run first because the set is a shopping mall, a real shopping mall. And I was writing my undergraduate thesis about a shopping mall and trying to kind of dig into all of the pop culture related to shopping malls and how they've been depicted and how they live in our imagination and all that stuff. So I think I started with that one and I was like, whoa, this is such a different approach to sci-fi than what you got at the time I was watching it and also now. And so I think that kind of got me interested in this era of sci-fi. And when you dig into it, it's like there are a few movies that really rise to the top in that world. And, Westworld's one of those.
Well, you managed to find a plot synopsis from a 1983 VHS release, which I don't know if you realize this, but that is all the more interesting because the film is apparently set in 1983. Did you know that?
Oh, I did not know that.
That's what I discovered.
That out?
I reading trivia and stuff. I don't think it's mentioned in the film itself, unless I missed it. But apparently, it's set in 1983. So. It's just another in a long line of science fiction movies where they set it in too near a future for like how different things were gonna. Like Terminator comes to mind. Back to the Future. Like there's a series of these movies that were made in like the 70s, 80s, and 90s where they're like, okay, it's going to be set 10 years in the future, and we will have flying cars and living on the moon. It's like, not even close, guys.
With this kind of movie, part of the idea is that, like, the world is basically exactly as you imagine it, except there's this one other thing that works differently. And like, I think that's what they're trying to do with this movie. When it's not like Back to the Future, it's kind of like, okay, guys, like that's maybe a little ridiculous. But this is basically like, you basically live in the exact same world. There just is this weird theme park where you can go kill robots for fun.
Yeah, which doesn't exist, but is not out of the realm of possibility. Maybe out of the realm of possibility in 1983, but certainly to have robots that you're going to have intercourse with. But
yeah,
which we're going to get into all this. But anyway, here's
are we?
Well, I don't know, man. Here is the plot synopsis from the 1983 VHS release of Michael Crichton's Westworld. Come pay a visit to Westworld, where the Old West comes alive once again in the not-too-distant future. Directed by award-winning writer Michael Crichton from his own script, this story of a technological paradise suddenly turned nightmare is a genuine shocker. An excellent cast... Wow, okay. An excellent cast makes this vision of a world gone wrong all too believable, and topping the bill there is Yul Brynner's remarkably eerie performance as a robot who develops a taste for the kill. A lawyer and businessman, Richard Benjamin and James Brolin, are among the visitors to Westworld, a futuristic theme park, in quotations, where the gun hands and dance hall girls are all robots programmed to serve the guests violent and lustful fantasies. See, I told you we were going to talk about the sex stuff. Until something goes wrong with their circuitry. No longer the guest's obliging victim, the black-clad humanoid gunslinger, played by Brenner, turns on the two heroes. The ultimate amusement turns deadly serious as the men's are pursued to a deadly climax by an implacable, unstoppable foe.
That's pretty much it.
That's the plot of Westworld, guys.
They didn't really miss almost anything.
Yeah.
Except, I guess, so the one thing it does miss, which is a weird characteristic of this movie, is that even though it's called Westworld, and even though this description doesn't really mention any of this, there are actually 3 worlds at this theme park.
Yes, there are.
There's Westworld.
Yeah.
There's like a medieval world.
Yeah.
And then there's an ancient Roman world.
Yes. It's maybe like 85% set in Westworld, and then 17 to 18% set in medieval world. And then, like there's like three seconds in Roman world. Well, okay, so but that leads me to my next question, Nate. Which world would you want to visit? And I think I know the answer because I know you pretty well, and I know what you. Yeah. I know your love of westerns, so I imagine. Yeah,
I think it would probably be the Wild West, but honestly, I don't know if I'd want to visit any of these. I mean, it's
in a world where they don't go wrong. Which one would you want to visit?
Yeah, okay. I guess probably Westworld. Let's be real. Michael Crichton talks a little bit about this, and I'm kind of moving ahead a little bit here, but all of these at the time this movie comes out are actually super dated genres. They're sort of meant to be a little throwbacky, and the movie even kind of looks a little throwbacky. It's like Robin Hood movies, and not like Sergio Leone westerns. Right. But like old Hollywood westerns. Like, I'm not sure exactly what he's getting at there, but it's weird.
Well, not sure what he's getting at here is maybe part of my thesis for this entire movie. But okay, well, to that end, let's talk a little bit about like where this movie came from. You did a little bit of research, so I mean, we've touched on him a little bit, but like, give me the background on Michael Crichton. Like, who is this guy? Because he's actually, for those who don't know, he is a fascinating individual.
Totally. Yeah, Michael Crichton is a pretty influential piece of our pop culture, I would say. And like, especially when we were growing up, he like just ran the show. His superpowers are, number one, identifying ideas that are sort of at the cutting edge of science in some way that would make great thrillers, and then translating them for a popular audience so that people can actually understand what the hell they're about. And again, like if you just think about Jurassic Park, like that's the perfect example of this, where it's just like, okay, genetics, right? And the ability to clone things, like super exciting technology that could have big implications for the way we live our lives. And, he sees the potential in that to talk about like, what could we clone that's the most exciting thing? Dinosaurs. Mm-hmm. And also like, what will actually drive that innovation? It's not the greater good. It's entertainment.
Yeah, totally.
Right? And so like, and that's very much like this movie as well, where it's like, okay, we can like build lifelike robots that could do anything a human can do. What do? We make a Western themed theme park where you could go kill them.
Or them. Yeah, exactly.
Or them.
He writes the kind of science fiction that I love, which is, I think when most people hear the term science fiction, they think space. They think Star Wars or Star Trek. Like, that's most people's concept of what sci-fi is. And I think that, generally speaking, is sort of what it tends to be. But he writes science fiction in the truest sense of the term, which is fiction based in science, which is a genre that I absolutely love. So, you know, anything related to viral outbreaks or, you know, genetic stuff or, you know, like even, again, like we talked about ER, like ER is, to call it science fiction is maybe not necessary. It's more a soap opera, I guess, realistically, but it is still like, it's a medical drama. So it is science fiction. So that's what I've always sort of found fascinating about Crichton, is that like he is perhaps the best known science fiction writer who writes that kind of science fiction, as opposed to like your Gene Roddenberry who writes, you know, space sci-fi or whatever.
Yeah. And so just to put a pin on like how influential Michael Crichton was, in 95, the year after this episode airs, Crichton had the #1 best-selling book in America, The Lost World, the sequel to Jurassic Park, the #1 movie in America, Congo, and the #1 TV show, ER. Yeah. No other writer has ever achieved this before or after.
Wow.
So, like, he was just running the show. Like, he was so influential on different aspects of our culture, and this movie is his directorial debut, basically. He directed like a TV movie before this, but nothing theatrically released.
Are you familiar with his writing at all? Like, have you read any of his stuff? I've seen other films of his, obviously both written and directed by him, but I have to admit, I've never actually read any of his stuff.
No, I'm the same. I've never actually read any of his books, but going through all of the movies that he's directed, or, well, more so the movies he's written, to be honest, I really like a lot of the movies that he's written. And so I feel like I do need to dig more into his books. But so the crazy thing is that he was actually trained as a doctor. He started writing his books in med school under like pseudonyms. And at first he was just kind of writing like schlocky genre stuff, basically. But the first book that he published under his real name was The Andromeda Strain, which became like a bestseller and then was actually, of course, adapted into a movie by Robert Wise in 1971. And apparently this was his biggest hit since The Sound of Music. So it's a pretty successful movie, a movie I have not seen.
I have seen it because, again, it sort of deals with like a viral outbreak, like very much my shit. But unfortunately is also very much a 1971 thriller in that it is boring as hell. Sure. I did not enjoy it. Apparently they did remake it as a miniseries in like the 2000s with like Eric Bana, I think, which I have not seen. But the premise of it was really exciting to me and I was like super stoked to watch it. And then I like sat down and watched it. I was like, this is not good.
But you're like, I'll just watch more Regenesis.
Yeah, I literally in my Letterboxd review, I was like, I could have watched like 4 episodes of Regenesis, and I should have. But I also don't think I really like Robert Wise as a director.
It's not like Star Trek: The Motion Picture is a particularly like thrilling movie either.
I mean, careful what you say, Nate.
There are good Star Trek movies. That is not my favorite one. So.
Okay, well, fair enough.
Yeah, so anyway, that was sort of like his sort of first foray into film in the sense of writing an adapted book, but he also actually spent time on set watching Robert Wise direct and kind of like learning the ropes from him. So that was also, I think, an important step towards this movie. Like I said, he directed a TV movie called Pursuit in 1972, not a movie I've ever heard of or seen, and that kind of brings us to Westworld. The interesting thing about this is that it's not adapted from a book of his. There is no, there was no Westworld book when this was released. He might have kind of released this later as like a novelization, but the original idea was a screenplay because, like I said, all of the sort of reference points for like, what is this theme park is basically allowing people to live out their movie fantasies, like living in a Western, right? Or living in a sort of medieval times action movie, a swashbuckler, that kind of thing. So it didn't really make sense for it to be a book, right? He wanted to kind of integrate not just literary tropes, but also like the shots that are in those kinds of movies. Like he talks about in one of the interviews with him, like in Westworld, whenever the good guys ride out of town, there's always a crane shot that sort of, you know, booms upward as they ride away. And then whenever they come in town, you do the reverse move. Like that's a Western trope in movies. And like, you can't do that in a book. So he always kind of imagined this as a movie. And apparently the sort of original concept was inspired by two things: Disneyland animatronics, which is, again, the Ouroboros is eating its tail. He went to Disneyland and saw, I believe it was the Hall of Presidents, like, you know, Abraham Lincoln doing his whole speech. Yes, that horrifying animatronic president, and was like, wow. Again, for the time, like, that was pretty lifelike. I think that maybe opened in the 60s, so it was sort of like fairly new at the time.
Right.
And then the other thing that he sort of witnessed was the training that astronauts were going through.
Interesting. Okay.
Astronauts have to learn how to control their physiology so much, right? Like their heartbeat, their breath, especially early on, the things they were learning to do were like these complicated procedures that you had to do in an exacting kind of way. And what he was sort of like piecing together in his brain is like, okay, we're now able to make these robots that seem very human, and meanwhile, we're training these humans to be more like machines. And that was sort of the inspiration for what becomes Westworld. Now, all that said, in other sources, I've also seen him say, like, yeah, people always ask me this question of like where I got an idea. And I've taken to just making up stories because like often it's just kind of like, you know, it's mysterious. Like, you know, you're a creative person and things just kind of like come to you in weird ways. Right. But, you know, he did think that he was probably influenced by these things. But yeah, and like, so this is sort of the very beginning of his career, and he goes on to both direct and write a lot of movies after this. Yep. He also directed The Great Train Robbery, which I've never seen. I've actually never seen any of his other movies.
I have seen
he's directed.
It's fine. It's interesting because it's Donald Sutherland and Sean Connery, I want to say.
Oh my!
And with like big like mutton chop, like it's,
of course.
Yeah, it's. I don't really remember anything about it beyond the costumes and the sort of like set design, and it's got that like decidedly like 70s look and feel. But this is the thing I will say about Michael Crichton is that, and I think this movie sort of exemplifies it. I think he's a really interesting writer and has really interesting ideas. I'm not sure that he's a particularly talented filmmaker.
I kind of agree. I mean, like this is the thing movie, that's his concepts, especially like his premises are so brilliant often that I feel like looking at his career, Hollywood gave him chances to direct again and again and again and again and again. And very few of them seem to be that successful. This might even be, I didn't do the math on this, but this might be the most successful movie that he directed.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at his filmography here. So we've got Westworld, a movie called Coma, The Great Train Robbery, Looker, Runaway, Physical Evidence, reshoots for the John McTiernan movie, The 13th Warrior, and then a video game called Timeline. So, no disrespect to the man, the late, great Michael Crichton, but like, you know, we discussed this, again, weirdly going back to Day of the Dolphin, like, the workman-like filmmaking on display there. This is kind of a workman-like movie. There's not to say there's no flashes of style. Like, there's that brilliant shot at the beginning of the movie with the like reflection in the glasses of the guy. Yeah. And then all the robot vision stuff. Like, there's some really cool stuff in this movie. But for the most part, it's like, it's very flat. Let's put it this way. I don't think Jurassic Park would have been the success it was were it directed by Michael Crichton. Like, you need a Steven Spielberg to take these ideas and elevate them to the level of spectacle that they arguably deserve.
I think, like, not only does he come up with great premises, but again, having kind of read into this particular movie a fair amount, I think, like, something that I would also add is that, you know, a lot of the most impressive visual parts of this movie were in the script, where like he actually wrote out like, I want this to happen. And then they had to figure out like visually, what does that actually mean? right? Like the robot vision that is so famous in this movie is in the script. And he didn't know exactly what that would mean, but he sort of demanded, like, if this is supposed to be how a machine sees the world, let's make the imagery using a machine. And it's like, at the time, we'll get into it, but that was pretty radical. And so it's like,
totally.
You know, that's not necessarily the work of a director per se. You know, some of it is. It's sort of in that crossover territory. But just the fact that he puts that stuff in the script where, you know, it can prompt an amazing director like Steven Spielberg to be like, okay, let's figure out how we're going to do this. You know, it's like the woman lies on the sick dinosaur, right? You know, like all that stuff, where you actually have to think about how that's going to happen. And if you have the budget and you have the right filmmaker, I mean, it can be magical. I mean, we talked a lot about Jurassic Park, but some of the other movies he's written are The Terminal Man, which I have not seen, Jurassic Park, of course, Disclosure, which is, again, pretty rough, Congo, and Twister, which I also love Twister.
I forgot that he wrote Twister, which is, that's great. Twister's great.
And that's another example where it's not exactly science fiction. It's like what you were saying about ER, where it's like, I don't think there's almost anything in that movie that's like completely unimaginable technology-wise or like futuristic, but it is a movie about science that is fictional.
Yeah, exactly.
So anyway.
I feel like this is a perfect transition to sort of talk about like the highlights and the lowlights of this movie, because I think this is a movie that has some really high highs, some really low lows, and as a result, like in the aggregate, is maybe a pretty average movie. But it's also like, spoiler alert, like I didn't hate it. I really enjoyed my time in Westworld, despite it being a deeply mediocre at times movie.
Yeah, so I think we have to start by talking about the premise a little bit. The thing that I had to kind of remind myself of with this is just like when this movie came out and just how early it was in the grand scheme of all these things. Because like now I feel like people probably watch this movie and they're like, yeah, I don't know, it's like a sci-fi thing, right? But like, just for some context, this movie comes out in 1973. Okay. The very first operating system, Unix, was invented in 1969. The very first computer virus was 1971, 2 years earlier.
Okay.
The very first like popular video game, Pong, is the year before.
Right.
Microsoft is founded in 1975, 2 years after this, and Apple was founded in 1976, 3 years after this. Right. So like personal computing doesn't exist. Right. Computer viruses barely exist. And he's imagining a world where not only do we have like robots, but like the explanation for why they go haywire is essentially a computer virus. Yeah. But the language for that barely even existed. The robot vision in this movie, jumping ahead a little bit again here, but it's basically like pixelated. It's what we would call pixelated, right? Didn't exist at the time. Right. There were no JPEGs. There were no image files. That didn't exist. Yeah. The only place that existed was NASA. Like a NASA scientist invented the word pixel or kind of revived it to describe the tiny bits of information that they used to take pictures of the moon and Mars in an academic paper. When they're describing the computer vision in this movie, like in, you know, American Cinematographer and things like that, they just describe it as a mosaic or a blocky image because the word pixel is not in popular use yet.
Yeah, like, and again, 1973, so weirdly, the same year as Day of the Dolphin and the same year as The Exorcist. But we're still like a few years out from Star Wars. Like, Star Wars is sort of that, we've talked about a lot. It's sort of this turning point in American cinema in terms of like, both stylistically, but also, you know, in terms of like pacing and editing and all this stuff. So like, this movie is very much ahead of its time. Obviously, like the whole time I was watching it, or at least for that final act, the chase, as we'll call it, or I'll keep referring to it, I couldn't stop thinking about Terminator. And like, this is 20 years before Terminator is going to come out. So it is remarkable in that sense. And you're right. I think we've talked about this ad nauseum on this show of like going back and revisiting these older films and watching them with a modern sensibility and a modern eye. It's very easy to forget what it must have been like at the time for it to be doing this. And sure, there have been movies that have maybe come along and done it better since, but it very much was the first one. And so you kind of have to give it some credit for that alone.
Yeah, and I think, like, honestly, of all the movies we've watched, I think this might be the most extreme example of that for me. It's hard to even wrap your head around how primitive computing was at this point in time when he's imagining this whole future of computers and robots and all that sort of stuff.
And not only that, like how prescient it is in terms of, you know, conversations we're having right now about the morality and the ethics of AI and robotics and like the idea of even just like on a very sort of basic level of like automation and how that's going to replace a certain level of jobs and careers, and what is the ethics and morality around that, and how do we compensate the people who are going to be replaced by automation and robots, and like this is conversations we're having now 50 years later. Like it's just so it was way ahead of its time.
Well, and like one of the things that I thought was really interesting hearing the scientists in this movie talk about the robots that really resonated today, that they were like, well, we don't even really understand how these machines work. Because they're machines built by other machines, and they kind of have their own internal logic. And it's like, that's exactly how machine learning works today, where it's like, you know, it may come up with a good answer sometimes, but we actually have no idea how it arrives at that answer. And that's really hard to accept and wrap your head around. And again, when you start talking about things like professional ethics, like, you know, who is liable for these things, you know, which is pretty relevant to this movie too, where it's like, well, I don't know, are the engineers liable? Or same shit with AI and machine learning today that we're already thinking about. Like, can an AI give you legal advice? You know?
Right.
Like, technically speaking, it probably can, but is it ethical to allow it to? Probably not, because who do you hold liable? So definitely, like, that is all in here. You brought up Star Wars. The other thing that really struck me as being quite prescient in this movie is the way we entertain ourselves and our desire for immersion. You definitely see this obviously in like open world video games. That's a perfect analogy. I mean, hell, we have Red Dead Redemption, right? I mean, like,
totally.
Isn't that basically Westworld? It's just that it's happening virtually instead of in real life. But then you also have the sort of recent shift in Disneyland. What are the newest rides at Disneyland, right? It's Galaxy's Edge, and the whole
Which you
thing
did
about
when
that,
you went to Disneyland, right?
I sure did. And like the most different thing about it compared to the other areas is that like there are a few rides. You don't go on that many rides. Most of what it is walking around and being treated by stormtroopers like you're in the movie, right?
Right. Yeah.
And like you can go get your lightsaber and you can go get a drink at a cantina. And the rides are all about immersion first and foremost.
Right.
They're not roller coasters. They're about feeling like you're in a starship. They're about being chased by Kylo Ren. Like that's what it's all about.
Right, because Disneyland, like the Magic Kingdom, I guess is what we would refer to it as. Like there's no real immersion there. Like, yes, okay, cool, you get to see Cinderella's castle and so on and so on. But like you never really feel like, oh, I'm in an animated movie, because like it's the suspension of disbelief and all that stuff. Whereas like you say, Galaxy's Edge and all the Star Wars stuff, it really, the whole purpose is to make you feel like you are living in a Star Wars movie.
Well, I think like the biggest difference is that when you see Cinderella in the Magic Kingdom, she treats you like you are you.
Right.
Whereas when you're in Galaxy's Edge, they treat you like rebel scum.
Okay, interesting.
It's not just that they're role-playing, you're sort of softly, gently role-playing
Interesting.
as well.
Yeah. Okay.
And like the most extreme example of this was the Galactic Star Cruiser. Do you remember this whole news thing?
That was the hotel that they opened or whatever, and then it didn't do so well because it was like exorbitantly expensive. And
but again, what an analogy for this movie! It's the same thing.
Literally,
what they were selling was an immersive experience where you're basically like locked in this hotel and you're part of this sort of drama that's like you're in a Star Wars movie. It's the same basic thing, and this was 1973. So anyway, when you think about that, it's like how ahead of its time this movie was. I do think that's kind of astonishing. And not in kind of like they got some things right, they got some things wrong. But like, there's actually very little in this movie premise-wise where you're like, that's ridiculous.
Oh, no, you know? Like, I honestly, like, at no point was I like, oh, this is too far-fetched. That's sort of
Right.
the brilliance of it, is that it all feels, right down to the sex robots, all feels very like, yeah, capitalism. If we had the technology today, this would exist. And to a certain extent, it does. And
Right.
we'll probably get a little bit further in the next 20, 30 years. I wouldn't put anything past us, because that's unfortunately what we do. So,
Yeah.
So I want to talk about the opening of the movie, because it's one of my favorite parts, I think. I was really sort of caught off guard,
good.
but I really, really enjoyed it. I will say I did feel it went on a tad too long.
Sure.
And again, it's just sort of this like his
70s pacing thing.
Yeah, it's his lack of experience as a director, I think, sort of shows through there. But it's a really interesting concept of like, the film starts with this essentially an advertisement for the series of theme parks. Is it called Dulles? Is that the name?
Delos.
Delos, yeah, which is like a reference to some Greek thing.
Dulles is an airport.
Yeah, Dulles is an airport. Delos is a Greek island. Or anyway, I did read some piece of trivia and I don't remember what it was. But anyway,
Sure.
And essentially it's a news report or advertisement, and they're interviewing people who have come back from the various worlds to say like, what was your experience like? It's setting up what you're gonna get in this movie, but it's this nice little piece of set dressing to establish the world that we're living in. And also, it's just like, again, you get to see this sort of like 70s style. And I think it does a really good job of putting you in the time and place that the film is going to unfold in.
Yeah, I love that. And you get to hear these interviews with the people who are coming back, and they're like, there's the one lady who's very like kind of sheepish about it, but like essentially she's like, I got laid by a robot.
What is the one thing that stands out in your mind about Roman world?
Oh, well, I think it would be the man. I just feel marvelous. I mean, it's just a warm, glowing place to be.
But yeah, no, you're totally right. And I love that they also like play with the aspect ratio here. Like it's a little thing, but just kind of like really putting you into that format and all of that. It feels like an advertisement. The other thing that I noted in this advertisement is that the cost of going to Delos is $1,000 a day. So I was like, okay, well, like how much is that? And I looked it up. It's about $7,000 a day.
Holy shit.
Right, which is a lot in today's money. But by comparison, so Disney's Galactic Star Cruiser cost $2,500 per night before it closed. And like part of the reason it closed is because that seemed too expensive. Would you pay $7,000 a day to have this experience?
No, I would not.
No, I don't think so either. But yeah, then after that, you're kind of on this hovercraft ride, right? Like you said, there's that brilliant shot of like the pilot's face wearing these aviator sunglasses, and you just see the desert kind of rushing past in the reflection in his glasses. And that kind of introduces you into the movie proper, and you're on a hovercraft and you kind of meet our main characters. So, Adam.
Yeah, let's talk about our main characters.
Yeah, what do you think of these two guys?
The least charismatic leads in the history of any movie I've ever seen.
I was kind of like, who are these people? Because, so we have Peter Martin, who's played by Richard Benjamin, and we have John Blaine, I think probably a not so subtle reference to John Wayne, played by James Brolin. So let's start with good old Dick Benjamin.
Well, so it's funny. As soon as he comes on screen, I'm like, oh, I know that face. I knew you were going
to say this.
I was like, is he the guy from The Last of Sheila? And then I looked it up and I was like, he's the guy from The Last of Sheila. Because you don't forget that mustache. Like, it's so funny. Like, it literally looks like it's a piece of makeup. He doesn't look like a real human being. Like, it looks like he's playing a character, but I guess that was his look at the time. It's his
mustache. That was the times,
Yeah, and he's he's fine in the movie, but like what's really crazy is that it does the classic sort of like 70s billing of, okay, so you're going to go left to right, but the person on the right, because we read left to right, is going to be a little bit higher in the frame in the billing.
Right.
Except he's like maybe like a centimeter or two higher. It's not like, because I can't remember I think it's The Towering Inferno is the movie that most famously did this to try and compensate for the billing. But obviously, like, Yul Brynner gets top billing, despite the fact that he basically has like 3 lines in this movie. But I guess he was the most famous person in the movie at the time. And then, of course, James Brolin, I think it's safe to say, goes on to greater fame than Richard Benjamin, because I at least know who James Brolin is. Whereas, like, Richard Benjamin, I'd seen him in The Last of Sheila, but otherwise do not know who this guy is.
I mean, that's what's so interesting about both of these guys is, like, I feel like at the time they seemed like real up-and-coming guys who, like, were in a lot of, like, you know, sort of well-respected movies of the time, right? I mean, like, James Brolin is more well-known, but, like, not that well-known, you know, in terms of
I mean, I guess
career.
he's probably best known because he's married to Barbara Streisand and his son is super famous now.
And Josh Brolin. Yeah, exactly. Like, I think that's probably... I knew who he was because I knew him as Josh Brolin's dad.
Oh, see, but I knew him because he was in the Amityville Horror. Like, to
right.
That was sort of
and
the
I haven't
thing
seen that movie.
Yeah, well, just don't bother. It sucks. I really like the remake, but anyway, we're not going to get into that. But it's funny. The thing that I actually know him most recently from is he was in the sitcom Life in Pieces, which is a great show. It's on Netflix. It's a great show. Colin Hanks is in it and Diane Wiest. It's like a family ensemble comedy. It's very, very funny. Morgan and I powered through it. Actually, when we had our son, and so, like, we were home, she was on mat leave, and you just, like, when you have a newborn, you're just looking for anything to sort of fill the time, and it was the perfect show for that. That's the performance that I most associate with him, but, like, to me, he's sort of the most famous name in the cast, but I recognize that at the time, that wasn't the case.
I think it's sort of a generational thing, too, where he went on to do a lot of things, but Yul Brynner had already done a lot of things.
Right, yes, of course, yes.
Yeah. But, like, I think at the time, Peter Martin, I think, was seen as kind of like, you know, he's
Richard
like
Benjamin?
Sorry, Richard Benjamin.
Well, no, but that's like that exactly, right? Like, you
those
don't
names are terrible. They don't register.
The characters have terrible names. The actors don't have particularly memorable names. He's not a particularly memorable.
Peter Martin, 2 first names. Richard Benjamin, also 2 first names. Very confusing. I think he was seen as like a going concern, because so, like, before this, he starred in Catch-22, and he also starred in Portnoy's Complaint, which is, believe it or not, a movie. Hey, it's parodied on The Simpsons, man.
Oh, okay. Well, there we go.
If I'm not mistaken, it is sort of a classic of Jewish literature, Jewish-American literature.
Okay.
And is parodied in relation to Krusty the Clown, I believe. So anyway.
Make sense, yeah.
So, yeah, and then The Last of Sheila is released the same year as this, just before it, which, like, I do want to pause. Like, probably most people don't know what that movie is, but I know that you have a soft spot for that one. You want to give the elevator pitch?
So, okay, Last of Sheila is a murder mystery written by Stephen Sondheim. Yes, the musical composer Stephen Sondheim, and directed by Anthony Perkins. Yes, the guy from Psycho. It is, and it rules. And for the longest time, it was impossible to find. I watched a DVD that I got from the library because that was literally the only way you could get a copy of it. And then in the last couple years, it finally got Blu-ray released by, I think it's like Warner Archives or whatever. But the reason it sort of became popular again is that it was apparently, according to Ryan Johnson, a huge influence on Knives Out. He put out a list of, like, the 10 movies that he sort of took the most inspiration from. And so I love that movie, and I love murder mysteries in general. So I sort of sought out everything on that list. And this was one that, again, when you get the pitch of, like, Stephen Sondheim wrote a murder mystery, like, I gotta see. And it's, again, it's just like a cast of who's of, like, 1970 stars. Like, it's just
like Richard Benjamin
and James Mason, and I'm pretty James Coburn, I think, is in it. It's like, it's just a wild, but really, really enjoyable and a lot easier to find now. So I highly do recommend people check it out. But yeah, not necessarily a movie that anybody has heard of. Borderline doesn't exist.
All right, well, let's talk about John Blaine, our James Brolin, a little bit here. I mean, again, like, he is also someone who kind of had things going on, like, leading up to this. So he was in a few movies that were parodied in The Simpsons as well. Von Ryan's Express, 1965.
Sure.
There's a scene where Uter gets left behind by a bus. I believe that is a parody of that movie. The Fantastic Voyage. Do you know that one? That's where they get shrunk down. Yeah. So it's like he's in that. He's in Skyjacked, which I believe is exactly what it sounds like. It is an airplane hijacking movie.
Great.
From a very different era where that was like not a terrorist act exactly, and more just a thing that sometimes happens,
Yeah. Oh, no big deal.
But probably most notably, he actually screen tested for the role of James Bond in Octopussy.
Yes.
When Roger Moore was like not sure if he wanted to go on.
And they very wisely decided no Americans will ever play James Bond. That was a terrible idea.
Right.
So they hired a Welshman instead.
Perfect. Well, yeah, maybe he's the one who like made that rule, a firm thing. Probably the thing that I first saw him in, probably without knowing it, is a little show called Beyond Belief, Fact or Fiction. Do you know this show?
I do not know.
I loved these kinds of shows growing up.
This sounds like something you would love growing up, just based on the title.
Basically, it was like two truths and a lie, but they would be telling stories. And what I remember is this show was hosted by Jonathan Frakes, who's from Star Trek, the Next Generation.
Guy.
And so
Riker? Is his name Riker?
Riker, there you go. That's
yeah,
right. Riker.
There you go. I never watched a Star Trek in my life, but I know. Yeah, Jonathan Frakes.
So we used to watch Star Trek as a family, Star Trek: The Next Generation, and so like that I think probably was my connection point, was like Jonathan Frakes. But apparently James Brolin was the host for the first season of this. So I probably watched him host this show at some point. So anyway, I thought that was kind of interesting. Like, he's someone who looks like a B-tier leading man, where he's like pretty handsome, but just doesn't quite have the je ne sais quoi to like be a real contender in that kind of role, I guess.
Well, I guess without jumping too far ahead, but I think part of the issue is that this is a really interesting premise, but it's not much else. Like, or at least what we end up getting. Like, I don't think these characters are particularly well drawn or particularly interesting. There's no real character development to them. We don't really know anything about them, which, like, to a certain extent, I appreciate. Like I said, I'm glad that we don't get into the history of, like, who created the robots and why did they malfunction and, like, sort of the Prometheus of it all. So I do like that element, but I do think that, like, as a result, you get these kind of poorly drawn, empty shell of a character that at the end of the day, if you don't have a really, really compelling screen presence playing, you're not super invested in them. And that's the thing. I was never really overly invested in what happens to these characters. And while I did find the chase at the end of the film tense, I was on the edge of my seat for it. At the same time, I didn't really care if the guy lived or died, and was sort of like, oh, well, I mean, I don't really know where this movie is going, and maybe they'll kill the main character, and then, that wouldn't be super surprising, and I won't be upset by it.
Yeah. The personal stakes seem really low.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the flaws with the film, is just like, again, it's a young filmmaker early in their career where he hasn't necessarily mastered everything about it. But I think, not the strongest visual style and not necessarily the strongest character development, which obviously, like, you look at something like Jurassic Park, like, he gets there. Like, he does figure this out.
Or Twister, for that matter.
Film,
also...
Totally. Okay, well, let's talk about Yul Brynner, though, because, like, he's, at the time, probably the biggest name in the film, despite the fact that the character that he plays, as I sort of alluded to earlier, has, like, essentially no dialogue. He's just sort of a presence. So it's a little bit surprising that they get that big of a name to play this part.
What I would say, though, is that, like, his last really memorable role in pop culture, I would say, is The Magnificent Seven, which is over 10 years before this.
True enough.
Because, like, he did the sequel to The Magnificent Seven called The Return of the Seven in 1966. But, like, and then he did a bunch of other roles, but they're not remembered like that is.
Right.
So he was very well known, but for very specific things that at this point were kind of behind him. And from what I read, he also needed the money.
I also read that, yes.
So I think that's part of it, but I want to back up because Yul Brynner is just a fascinating human being. And so I have to give you some of the details of his life story. So
yeah, because I know obviously, like, the thing that he's most famous for, The King and I. But beyond that, I don't really know anything about the guy.
Yeah. So he's considered sort of like one of the first Russian-American movie stars, which is a pretty cool thing in and of itself. But he also had this incredible life story. And apparently he was also known to embellish it all the time, like give alternative names, talk about his parents in ways that are not exactly true, or changed where he was born, like all of those kinds of things. But it's kind of remarkable that he would go to those lengths to make stuff up, because the actual true story is so insane. And these tall tales went to the point where even his obituary in the New York Times actually got the details of his life wrong.
Oh, wow.
So just to give like the I can never remember which is Canadian, which is American, the Cliffs/Coles Notes version of it.
Coles is Canadian, I'm pretty sure, but yeah.
Okay, thank you. So first of all, he's born in Russia before the rise of the Soviet Union. So he actually witnesses the Russian Revolution as a child, right?
Oh, Jesus.
Moves to China, learns to play guitar and sing from his older sister.
Okay.
Moves to Paris. In Paris, he performs in a cabaret, singing and playing guitar. He joins the circus, no joke, learns how to do the trapeze. Then gets to know Jean Cocteau and his friends like, Picasso, Salvador Dali, Marcel Marceau, Jean Marais, like those are all his buddies in Paris. Then he moves to Switzerland because he had developed an opium addiction to deal with his back injury from the trapeze. And he recovers from his addiction.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you're right. When in Paris, he does recover from his opium addiction and basically like never touches drugs again. He goes back to China, learns to act from his new stepmother, who actually trained with Stanislavski and Chekhov.
Okay. No slouch.
And then he finally moves to New York.
Wow.
And during World War II, he actually worked for the American government propaganda radio stations, which they would basically like pump radio signals into occupied France and the Soviet Union. And so like he knew French, he knew Russian, so he was the one who was saying these things. This is all before he has like a great grasp of English.
Okay. Jeez.
So after he finally learns English, he's taking on some smaller roles as he's learning. And then he stars in the stage musical The King and I, as well as its 1956 film adaptation. And this is sort of an iconic role for him, of course. Like, if you're familiar with the iconography of this show, probably one of the first things you think of is that bald guy. That's Yul Brynner.
Yeah.
Right?
That bald guy who is apparently not Asian, which, like, to be honest, I don't think I knew, because he kind of has
not
that
Siamese.
vaguely, he's like a vaguely ethnic look, and he's best known for playing the King of Siam, so, like, I guess I just always assumed that he was Asian.
No, he's not Siamese, and, it's that sort of a classic Broadway/Hollywood trick of being like, you're not from here, right? You could play Siamese.
Yeah, exactly.
So anyway, he becomes so associated with this role that he shaved his head for that role, and he shaved his head for the rest of his life, basically. Wow. And then after that, he kind of continues on in Hollywood, and some of the other sort of like significant roles he ends up playing are Ramses III, maybe, in The Ten Commandments. Also a sort of bald role played by a vaguely ethnic person, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yep. Mm-hmm. You're Egyptian, right? Yeah, totally. Put on this bronzer. And then, of course, The Magnificent Seven. He is one of the seven. And probably most notably, he wears the exact same outfit in that movie as he wears in this movie.
Yeah, which is a nice little touch.
Yeah, so it's like clearly he gets cast in this because I bet that they probably were looking around for someone of Yul Brynner's stature broadly, who was like a Western star who'd be willing to take this role. And, probably any of the Magnificent Seven probably could have been in this. But thank God they got Yul Brynner, because I think it's by far the best performance in this movie, and is the thing that makes this better than just a mediocre sci-fi movie. I would agree. His performance, and also, to be fair, the way that final act is directed is really what makes it stand out.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's talk a little bit about the sort of look and feel of this movie. And again, we've been talking around it, but it's not very good, Nate. Like, it's not. This movie is so interesting for me because I don't love it and I don't hate it. It's kind of middling. I think it's a really interesting premise. Not poorly executed, but certainly not executed to the level that I think it could be. And one of the things that I sort of just kept thinking as I was watching it, I was like, God, this movie looks so flat. like it's not moody at all. There's no sense of drama going on.
Yeah.
Which I get the sense was maybe a stylistic choice. I don't necessarily agree with it, but...
Right. I have some background that might help explain this. So I think part of it is what you're saying, that, this is a quote from Crichton describing the style of this film. He says, "The style, I think, is very straightforward, very conventional, and very traditional. In many ways, it's the way the film would have been shot, sequence by sequence, had the sequences appeared in a 1940s Western or a 40s version of Robin Hood." Right? So it's like, he's definitely trying to make something that looks like an old-fashioned movie. I think that's part of it. But also, I think what's going on is that this movie was shot for $1.3 million.
Even in 1973, like, not a lot of money.
No, it was really not a lot of money. Like, just to put it in real context, their budget for set construction was $75,000.
Jeez. Wow.
So it's like, they were working with, like, nothing. The other factor at play is, like you were saying, Michael Crichton is a first-time director, and he's working with a cinematographer who is very much like taking his requests at face value and not pushing back on things. And Crichton in interviews is sort of like, it's so great to work with someone who just like, here's what I'm asking and then figures it out.
Yeah.
But the flip side of that is, like, for example, Michael Crichton was like, I really want to do some shots where, there's like a 360-degree pan. Which, on the face of it, you're like, okay, sure, fine. But it means that your set has to be all the way around you, right? And therefore, you also need to figure out how to light it in such a way that it's visible from all angles. And so what's the answer to that question? You light it from above.
Yep.
And you light it with soft light. And so all of those scenes where they're like in the control room, that's what they look like. It's just lit very evenly and very flat because they're moving around in such a way that it kind of requires that. Now, to be fair, like, directors like, say, I don't know, Stanley Kubrick, have figured out how to do this, right? Where it's like, well, then you like can light in through the windows and do things like that give it that sort of dramatic flair while also allowing you to play with that a little bit more. Like, if you're talking about Full Metal Jacket, or you're talking about Barry Lyndon, which like famously uses a lot of like natural light, right? Yeah. Like, he's figured out how to do that, but it's Stanley Kubrick, right? I mean, so it's sort of like,
and that's the thing. That's sort of what was getting at, is like, a film like this has the potential to be visually interesting as it is conceptually interesting. When you hear him sort of describe that he wanted it to look and feel like a 40s film, it's this weird thing of like, it's a dated film referencing an even more dated style of filmmaking. So when you're watching it 50 years later, it's just like, it kind of just has this especially like ultra dated look and feel, which is maybe part of it. And it's just unfortunate that his approach doesn't allow the film to have that visual flair outside of the few moments where it does. Because again, it's not to say it's completely without it. The glowing eyes of the robots and the robot vision that we've talked about, like, there are these little touches of visual flair. And again, it's just part of the expectations of what we expect from a film like this. It's a sci-fi movie. You think about, THX 1138, or you think about Star Wars, or you think about like Aliens, excuse me. And the sort of visual language that becomes established within the next decade following this film. And this just feels so far removed from that.
Yeah. So his argument was that the premise was so weird that he wanted to use a more conventional film language to let the premise shine and not be like, isn't this weird? Oh, look how crazy this is, because that could just kind of get annoying and maybe undercut the premise, which that argument makes sense to me. Like, a great example of this, and this is one of my favorite movies, is Being John Malkovich, where it's like, that movie is absolutely batshit. It's an insane movie. The premise is bizarre, but it's shot like a documentary, right? And like, the lighting is really plain. It's not like dramatic and high contrast. If I'm remembering correctly, there's a fair amount of like shaky cam and stuff like that. Like, that's a great example of how to do what he's describing. Or even like, same writer, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. Very inventive movie, but then like when you're in the real world, it looks like real life, right?
Yeah.
To me, that's the way to do what he's arguing this movie does, which is to play up the real worldness of it. But what this movie does is actually it plays on movie conventions. It's not mimicking documentaries, it's mimicking old movies. To me, it's the wrong conventions to do what he's arguing. If this movie felt like a documentary and had the premise it had, it would be f***ing wild. Like, it would be incredible.
Yeah, imagine the William Friedkin version of this movie. Like, it would just be, it could be terrifying.
Yes.
And in the end...
That's a perfect analogy, yes. If Billy Friedkin made Westworld, I mean, damn. Like, that would have been incredible. Really, really incredible.
Yeah. Although it would have had a very long prologue set in like...
yeah.
Completely...
In the factory in China where the robots are created.
Exactly. So,
I do want to talk about one more aspect of the visual language of this.
Yeah, okay.
Which is the editing. Which I actually think is maybe one of the more interesting aspects of this movie. It's not doing anything flashy, but I think like one of the weird things about this movie is that, and it's somewhere between the editing and the script, is that you keep going back and forth between the different worlds. And the only like really named characters are the two we talked about. But then you actually follow other patrons of the park in their adventures in the other worlds. But like they don't have any character. They're not giving a name. They're not giving backstory, nothing, right? Yeah. So you're just like watching them kind of like, you know, experience medieval world and then like things go wrong. Or there's like another patron of Westworld who like becomes the sheriff and that kind of stuff. It's really weird. Yeah. It's really breaking the conventions of film in a lot of ways. So I don't know. I was curious what you thought about that.
No, it's true. I always found it funny because I was like, the movie's called Westworld, and we're spending a lot of time in this other non-Westworld that doesn't seem to be going anywhere. Like, what is the purpose of this? And like you say, unnamed characters, but it all is sort of building to this inevitable sort of breaking point. And I did sort of like when in the medieval world and they have the fight and the robot stabs the guy. Like, literally just stabs him in the stomach. I was kind of like, whoa, okay, I wasn't expecting that. Like, I understood that the robots are, you know, malfunctioning or fighting back, but I wasn't expecting this sort of, like, cold-blooded, sort of violent act to happen. So, and I also think the film is incredibly well-paced. Like, I really appreciate that it's a tight 90 minutes. I never found myself, like, overly bored. I do think the amount of slow motion in this movie is borderline Zack Snyder levels of slow motion. It feels very unmotivated and very showy and kind of in that horrible way of like, why are we doing this? But
it's a lot like Full Metal Jacket too. It's always like when someone's being shot, when someone falls through a window, like it's always that same move again and again.
That sort of ties back to this idea of like, oh, I want to make it feel like a 40s Western because like obviously they do that and use that sort of language. But despite that, I do think the film is very well paced. And when I paused it at that sort of halfway mark and I'm like, where is this going? I was surprised that I was like halfway through because I was like, oh, okay, we still haven't quite gotten to the premise, but I assumed that meant like we were only like 20 minutes in and then we're going to get to it. And then but it was like, no, like the movie's almost over. And so I was sort of like surprised by that. So yeah, it is an interesting structural approach to telling this story.
I think it helps them like raise the stakes a little bit as well, because if you just jumped to Yul Brynner malfunctioning and then his friend gets shot, spoiler, James Brolin, it would be abrupt. But like by that point, you saw this nameless guy in medieval world get stabbed. So I think it's a way of building the tension of the story without tipping off our main characters yet that something's wrong.
Yes. The other thing I really like from a stylistic standpoint, or just like from a craft standpoint, is the score. It's kind of got like a quasi-tangerine dreamy, like it's electronic, and it's at first it's very sort of like unassuming, and again plays up this sort of idea of what he's talking about of like old-timey and feeling of the era. They're sort of mimicking. But then it gets into this sort of like, again, once the chase kicks off, it gets into this really sort of
electronic stuff.
Driving electronic sort of menacing score that I just was like, I'm digging this. This is really working for me.
They parody it very well on The Simpsons in another parody, which we'll get to soon. But yeah, no, totally. I love the score. I think the one piece that kind of drives me crazy is the bar fight scene.
God, yes.
Where they're like, let's have a comedic score. And the score is just like, it's basically yakety sax, right?
Yeah. That scene in general doesn't work for me. I think it's just like, it's kind of out of place and
it's trying
silly.
too hard to add that sort of comedic element. Other than that, though, I love the weird contrast between that sort of like, traditional Western score and then the electronic stuff that sort of creeps in more and more throughout the movie. Like, I think maybe one of the early times when you hear it is like, they go to sleep and the park shuts down and then like all the trucks come into Westworld and start picking up the corpses and bringing them over to robot repair. Like, I love that. That's actually probably one of the most cinematic, best scenes in the movie, I think, is when that happens. And I think that's maybe when you start hearing the electronic score. And then as you get to the third act, it like really, really kicks in. So
there's actually, it's funny you mentioned that. There's another moment that really stuck out to me that it's funny because when they shut the park down and our heroes come out and they kind of they're like, whoa, everything's very quiet. Like, what's going on here? And it's supposed to be this real like tense moment of like eeriness and like, what is going on here? But because the film has such a low budget and there's basically been no extras throughout most of this movie, and the park, despite being this massive theme park, is pretty empty, it doesn't quite have the like punch that it should, because it's like, well, it's been pretty empty this whole time. Like, it's one of those moments where I was like, again, it's like, this is a really, really interesting idea, and if it had been executed properly along the way, would have been like really eerie if you had like all of a sudden gone from a bustling theme park like Disneyland to a completely empty space and you're just these two patrons and where is everything? Like, that would be terrifying. But it doesn't ever actually like pay off quite well enough because this movie doesn't have the budget that it needs to really do it. So
no, 100%. Let's talk about the special effects, because I really think that is where this movie shines for the most part. There's some things that are better than others.
No pun intended.
Indeed. But I think that it does some really inventive stuff here that, again, was like so influential. So, let's talk about those reflective eyes that you mentioned.
Yeah.
So, like, Yul Brynner's character, the gunslinger, as they call him, again, this is one of those things that was, like, written into the script by Crichton. He was like, I want him to have electronic eyes. His eyes need to look like he's a machine. And so they like experimented a bunch with like different techniques for doing this. And what they ended up settling on was silver coated contact lenses, which is pretty cool. Because in the movie, it is hard to kind of figure out exactly what it is you're looking at. But knowing that, you can kind of see it. It's like, it's just that his irises look too shiny is basically what it is. But the interesting thing is, before they landed on that solution, the DP was like trying to figure out the answer to Crichton's question, basically, like, how do you do electronic eyes? And he was like, he wanted to use a two-way mirror and project a beam of light directly into Yul Brynner's eyes on the same optical axis as the camera. But he was like, in the American Cinematographer, it doesn't work. I thought it would work. It doesn't work. You can't actually do that.
Right.
Does that technique sound familiar?
Yeah. Yes, because it was the thing that the whole time I was like, holy shit, Blade Runner stole this from Westworld.
Exactly.
Like, but it does it without the sort of like trickery of using contact lenses, and it does sort of the natural thing that we witness in real life of how light can reflect usually in animals' eyes, but gives it that sort of otherworldly, eerie presence because it's a little bit more realistic. And is obviously a key plot element in Blade Runner. But yeah, 100%, I immediately, like, that was the first thing that came to mind. I was like, hey, this is a cool effect. Hey, they did that in Blade Runner. Blade Runner definitely ripped this off, but Blade Runner definitely did it better, so.
Yeah, but see, that's the thing, is that, like, not only did Blade Runner, basically do the same thing visually or story-wise, but, like, the technique that they use in Blade Runner is exactly what the DP tried to do for this, and was like, it doesn't work, I can't do it. And they figured it out for Blade Runner. So, like, I thought that was super cool. And it is a great way to just, like, subtly indicate that, like, this isn't a person. There's something different going on. So, such a cool idea. And again, like something from this movie that has such a long tail, because everyone thinks of Blade Runner when they think of that technique.
Well, the other thing that this movie does that has an incredibly long tail, and we've been referencing it multiple times, is the robot vision, which, like, again, it's a very primitive form of what we will see done to death in science fiction for the next 5 decades, be it in RoboCop, Terminator, like everything. Like, it's a Predator, like, it's just, this is going to be done to death. And in a weird way, like, I think this is kind of maybe the best implementation of it in a weird way.
Yeah.
Like, there's something about it that feels much more robotic and less, I'm just going to do like a visual, stylistic sort of representation of what it might be like. Like, this is the only instance where it actually does feel like maybe this is, I'm seeing an actual image processing of a non-human entity versus like, I'm just going to put like a red filter and some computer text on screen. Like,
yeah, I think like the thing that works so well about the computer vision here is that it has clear rules, about like how it works. And particularly when his like eyes get damaged by the acid or whatever. At first, like the computer vision is full color and he can see everything. After that, it's only the red color that's coming through.
Right.
And so that's how our protagonist sort of tricks him, because he can't differentiate between a human being and the fire, right? Like of one of the torches. But that technique feels like, the rules of how this work are really clear. Whereas like, if you look at The Terminator or you look at Predator, right? It's like all of these movies that steal this idea, basically. The rules aren't clear, right? The text that comes up is all sorts of things. And there's all sorts of symbols and bullshit in them. And it's fine to have a higher resolution, obviously, than the Westworld version of this where it's really blocky. But like, even if you had high quality video resolution in your robot vision, having a more limited set of tools that kind of illustrate how the robot is analyzing the situation would probably make it feel a little bit more like this, a little bit more like there are clear rules. We understand how the robot thinks about things. Ironically, I think The Simpsons does a pretty good job of this, because they also parody this whole idea of robot vision several times. It's kind of a runner, and they tend to kind of mix together all of these different movies, into their parody. So like even in Itchy and Scratchy Land, they do the kind of pixelated look like in Westworld, but it actually has text as well. It accidentally identifies Homer as Scratchy or Itchy or whatever and says kill, right? Like the rules of how those robots work is very clear. Yes. Earlier in the episode, you see it identify another robot and be like, Itchy, kill. I think that's the thing that's often missing with this trope that has come out of this movie. I kind of gave a bit of the background of this technology and like how this came to be, but it is such a wild story that, like, again, Crichton just wrote this in the script and was like, so the gunslinger has some kind of robot vision. And then he tasked someone with figuring out what that means. And all he said is like, the image should be made by, a machine.
Right.
And so basically this guy, John Whitney Jr., was tasked with figuring it out. He gets a credit on this movie that is automated image processing. Like, what a cool credit. Yeah. And this actually ends up being the first computer-generated image on film.
That's super cool.
He had to go to NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory to find the technology to create this image. And they were like, yeah, totally, we could do that. It'll just cost about $100,000 for the 2.5 minutes of footage that they needed.
Wow.
And they were like, well, again, like, we don't have the budget for that. So luckily, Whitney was able to find a private company that actually was working on a similar prototype, and they were able to do it for a lot quicker and cheaper. So he was able to kind of figure it out that way. They had to like write a program to even make images on a computer at the time, because again, technology didn't exist. Then they had to like film the results of it, essentially.
Right.
Like, so really interesting. But in this article from American Cinematographer, again, I keep referencing it, they did a whole issue about Westworld when it came out. Cool. Whitney basically wrote about this process. As time goes on and the computer systems which do this work become faster and cheaper and smaller, it should be possible to think of a quote-unquote electronic optical printer with broad applications in feature films, commercials, in fact, any visual area.
Wow.
I mean, again, it's just hard to place yourself in this moment in time where, like, now we just take this for granted. I mean, hell, we complain about, CGI goop all the time.
Yeah, all the time.
And yet, at this point in time, like, this had never been done before. So that,
right.
I really think that's pretty incredible.
Absolutely. That segues nicely into the thing that I think is the best part of the film and is sort of where we see all this sort of robot vision, which is the final sort of like 20-ish minutes of the movie, which is the gunslinger is chasing after our hero, Peter Martin. So effectively, he's reprogrammed, he's upgraded, he's got new audio-visual capabilities, and the next morning he confronts our two characters and shoots James Brolin's character, much to James Brolin's surprise, because he's been told earlier in the film that this is not a possibility. Nothing could possibly go wrong.
Possibly go wrong.
And then basically, from that point on, it's just the gunslinger's relentless pursuit of Peter Martin through all of Delios, from Westworld to Roman world to medieval world, until we get to the end of the film. And I do genuinely think that this is, it's really, really strong storytelling and filmmaking. But it's in that great way that our high school film teacher would have talked about, the concept of the chase and how you can do incredible storytelling with essentially no dialogue whatsoever. Because I think, I can't say for certain, but apart from the last 5-ish minutes when he finds the woman who's been, or the robot, I should say, who's chained up, and he sort of talks to her and gives her water and then she malfunctions, there's really not a ton, if any, dialogue. It's just basically... the gunslinger relentlessly chasing this guy through the various sets and locales of the film. It's really, really good. It's really powerful. Obviously, you can't help but think of things like The Terminator when you watch it, though, as someone who doesn't particularly like the first Terminator movie, I think this is far more effective and menacing and scary because... and it's weird because, like, Arnold is a menacing presence, but he's not... His strength has never been his acting chops. I don't know, there's something about, and you sort of touched on it, Brenner's performance here, that even though he's not saying anything and he's really just sort of like walking and firing his gun, you get this sense of he is unstoppable and will not rest until he gets his man, and it's kind of terrifying.
There are some really awesome details in his performance that sell it so well. Like, for example, for a lot of the chase, you have our protagonist kind of running frantically around, and then you just cut back to Brenner, and he's slowly walking forward at a steady pace. He's got his hands around his belt buckle, and they just stay there like exactly still for a lot of that. And then, the other thing is, there are a few shots, I believe, of him shooting, and he never blinks. His eyes are always open. And of course, like, wincing and blinking, it's like that's a natural human reaction when you're firing a gun or anything like that. Even I think if you're trained, you're probably going to like react and wince a little bit. There's like a couple other moments where his pose is too perfect. It is like cinematic. He looks like he's in a Western, but he's like not moving, like just stuff like that is subtle. But again, he's just really killing this performance. There are a lot of details that not only make this a great performance, but also have been cribbed to death by his other movies, which I'll get into shortly. But I did want to touch on the Simpsons parody of this chase, because I think it's a really interesting example of how parody works on the Simpsons. So there's a scene in the episode The Boy Who Knew Too Much, which is from season 5, another David Merkin season. And so basically Bart is cutting school and he's trying to like have his day out causing mischief, and Skinner is on his tail. And the way Merkin describes it on the commentary is he's slowly transforming into the Yul Brynner robot from this movie, basically.
Interesting.
But the thing that's interesting about this is that, like, I've seen this sequence posted online frequently where people are like, how is this a parody of Westworld? Because
Right.
there's, in particular, they're sort of talking about the Westworld stuff in the section of this sequence where Skinner is coming towards Bart, and Bart crosses a river and cuts the bridge, right? And Skinner sort of like walks through the river and completely submerges and then comes out the other side, right?
Yeah.
And it is like such a cinematic sequence, but people are always like, but where is that in Westworld? I don't get that. Like, they're saying it's from Westworld, but it's not in Westworld. Now, having like watched it and like watched that sequence again in detail, I think I kind of, now I understand like what exactly they're parodying and how, and also the stuff that's like not a parody. So like when Skinner stands up after licking the gum, you'll notice that he actually puts his hands around his belt buckle, just like Yul Brynner does in all of these scenes. So there's like a little detail there. But then it's also like the overall vibe of that whole scene, right? Skinner's walking, Bart's running frantically. You know, of course, the landscape goes from, you know, your usual Springfield landscape to kind of this desert landscape. And most importantly, too, I think the score from our good friend Alf Clausen really starts to sound like that sequence from Westworld. And so
Definitely.
it's more the look and feel of it, but it's not actually him walking across the river. That's just like a, you know, Jeffrey Lynch, Brad Bird original. Brad Bird in particular, I mean, he has such an incredible visual sense, and his movies are filled with unique visual set pieces like that. That's not surprising to think that he might have just come up with that.
Totally.
I think it's interesting because The Simpsons it's actually filled with moments like this that feel like and look like and smell like and sound like they must be a parody of something, but you can't actually figure out what the hell it's a parody of. Moments that break the reality of the show or feel out of sync with the usual style of the show. They're kind of these enigmatic parodies or references that, like, some of them may be a reference to something obscure that they just don't mention on the commentary, and some of them might just be some weird thing that like came from a writer's brain, and it just feels like it's a parody of a movie or it's a style parody or something.
Are you a big Weird Al fan? I genuinely don't know your answer to this, but like the way I sort of think of it now is how Weird Al has sort of two kinds of parodies, right? He has song parodies, which are like, you know, Eat It. Like he's taken Michael Jackson's Beat It and he's going to make it all about food, and it's all food references to the tune of this song. But then he does these things that are like style parodies. He'll do like a Prince parody. The melody is not a specific Prince song, but it's just in the style of a song that Prince would write. And I think that's sort of the thing that we are getting in this instance, is that it may not be a direct shot-for-shot reference to a sequence from Westworld, but it's trying to crib the visual language, although we're arguing there isn't necessarily a ton of visual language there, but like the elements of Westworld to sort of give that impression and give that sort of sense of the film or what that film is trying to achieve without being a direct, like, one-for-one reference to something that happens in the film. And I think the thing that really is throwing everybody is that, I would argue, iconic moment where Skinner walks into the water, the score stops, and then he resurfaces and the score kicks up again. And it's just, it's a brilliant cinematic moment that I guess people just sort of like, well, that has to be from something else. There's no way. But you're right. It's just, no, it's like, yes, they commonly do parodies and they're parodying, you know, classic filmmakers, but they are filmmakers in and of themselves, and they are capable of doing really, really quality filmmaking on their own. I mean, we've talked about this on various episodes before, of like how sometimes these Simpson episodes can be like gorgeous cinematography and gorgeous sound design, and like there's an artistry there that I think we too often don't give the show credit for. And I think this scene in particular that we're describing is a perfect example of, yes, while it's got its origins and its basis from Terminator and Westworld, it's still the Simpsons' own take on it. And that take is so powerful that everyone just assumes, well, this has to be from something else.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It feels so creative and unique that people think it must be from something else, but they're just creative and unique as animators as well as the writers, right? That's, I think, the key thing. So one other thing I wanted to talk about with this chase scene is, you know, you've mentioned the Terminator. Did you know that there's actually a direct connection to the Terminator?
To Westworld?
Yeah.
Oh, no, I didn't know that.
So James Cameron actually had Arnold Schwarzenegger model his performance off of Yul Brynner.
Well, there you go.
So there you go. But even more interesting than that, because like that kind of makes sense. It's like, okay, well, unstoppable robot. Yeah, sure, of course, right? What else would you think of? That's the classic performance. Did you know that Michael Myers in Halloween is modeled after Yul Brynner?
Interesting. That makes a lot of sense.
Yes.
That almost makes more sense to me.
John Carpenter says he was directly inspired by this.
Interesting. That makes a lot more sense to me, especially if you look at how those two characters are portrayed and sort of like the sort of lack of dialogue from Michael Myers. Yeah, that's super interesting.
But again, like think about this for a second, right? Halloween is a movie that launched 1 million slasher movies.
Yeah.
And it's inspired by this movie. So it's like this weird, obscure, somewhat obscure 1970s sci-fi movie is like indirectly, partially the progenitor of all these slasher movies, as well as all these sci-fi movies. It's crazy to me that like, as much as this movie is, you know, it's not amazing, it is kind of this Rosetta Stone for all of these other influences that have echoed across the years.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
I did want to ask you about the very last moments of this film, because, you know, at the end of this chase, you mentioned he like finds this woman in the medieval dungeon and frees her and tries to give her some water. And then it turns out she's a robot, so he fries her, basically, which was a pretty interesting moment. At this point, he's already like set Yul Brynner on fire, right? And so he thinks he's done with him.
And in fact, I do want to draw attention to that moment where he sets him on fire, because this is that peak. We're gonna actually light a dude on fire era of filmmaking, and it looks like it's insane that we used to do that. We still kind of do that, but mostly everything is like CGI now, and like the CGI looks great, and we don't have to endanger actors or stuntmen, and that's wonderful. But like, there is something to be said for the viscerality of a man clearly covered in an insane amount of gasoline that's been lit on fire. Because it is not a modest fire on it. Like, he is.
Oh, no, it's huge.
He's like the Human Torch. Like, it is wild how on fire he is. So it's an incredible visual moment. But yeah, so he's torched Yul Brynner, and you assume, okay, well, the robot is gone. We don't have to worry about him anymore. But of course. Yeah. I've seen enough movies to know, no, never think that. They always come back for one more scare, as they say in Scream.
But again, like, was there a movie before this that pulled that same sort of like? I actually don't. I don't know. For that. There very well might have been. There's a long movie history before this, but like, you know, again, this is pre other slasher movies. Basically, Black Christmas comes out the year after this, right?
Yeah.
So it's like there aren't a lot of precedents for this kind of stuff. So I'd be curious, but like, yeah, there's one final scare in this movie, which I think is pretty damn good, where the Yul Brynner robot comes back, but it has no face and it's just pitch black, burned.
Yeah.
And it just like is on the stairs, and he turns around and he sees it, and you get a real close up of this robot, and it's a scary image. Like I think it's really good. It's genuinely disturbing. It doesn't necessarily even feel dangerous. It just feels wrong.
Yeah, it's very unsettling. And then the robot falls off the stairs, and then you get a very clear look of this like faceless machine thing. And it's a very unsettling image, but also a very cool image. I think it's a great little button. The only problem was like, I just saw it coming a mile away. I think it's just a filmmaking thing of like, in the right hands, that moment could have been a real like shock. But the way it was sort of drawn out, and I was like, dude, like, you're acting like everything's fine. Like, there's no way everything's fine. Like, you got your little mini scare with the robot lady. Like, you really think Yul Brynner's gone for good? And then I was surprised at how far gone they revealed him to be. Like, I thought he was going to come back and be totally fine. So there was a bit of a twist there, in that he just basically reaches his arm out and then falls. And who knows, maybe in 1973 people didn't see that coming. But after 50 years of twist endings that are not dissimilar, it was just like, oh, I know where this is going. But I do love that then that's just how the movie ends. Like, it's a very nice, clean, abrupt There's no aftermath. There's no like cleanup. There's no trying to explain this. You know, at the end of Psycho, a movie which I love, where they have to then explain why Norman Bates went insane and murdered all these people. And it's like this 15 minutes of a psychiatrist being like, well, actually, like there's nothing like that here. It's just, no, it ends on this nice, clean little scare. And that's,
Yeah, he like sits down on the stairs and looks tired, basically.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then this actually leads nicely into our next segment, the parts that seem like Simpsons jokes but aren't. But you get this kind of echoey voiceover.
Right, yes, I forgot about that, yeah.
Where it just repeats the same thing over and over again. That's something like, you know, Westworld, where nothing can possibly go wrong. Possibly go wrong. Possibly go wrong. Which actually feels very much like a Simpsons joke to me, because they've done that a million times, like, Lisa needs braces.
Yeah,
you know?
Exactly.
That definitely made me think of The Simpsons, that ending. Even though it's pretty effective, but it was also a little funny. Was there anything for you that stood out like that?
You also mentioned it, the bar fight. Like, it definitely has this sort of like zany, slapsticky, Simpsons-esque, even the way it's structured of like, you know, people are swigging booze and then throwing punches. I think it's the weakest section of the movie. I kind of understand its purpose, but it just feels out of place.
They're trying to do like a foreground, background sort of thing where they're like playing the cards in the foreground and then there's the fight in the background. It kind of should be funny, but they're just not pulling it off. It's the type of thing that the Simpsons would do and pull off properly, where you have that sort of foreground, background contrast and that kind of thing.
Okay, so Nate, you know, we've sort of discussed that this movie, like, obviously has had a surprising amount of influence, but was it successful upon release? Like, what was the box office performance for this?
This is like before that era where like box office numbers are really clear cut.
Yeah.
So I found different sources about how much it actually made, but definitely it made $2 million in its opening weekend. So there, it made back its budget. And the number that keeps coming up in a few different places is about $10 million in its initial run. So it's pretty good. It's not like the best performing movie of the year or anything, but like it way more than made back its budget, right? That's like, I don't know, but almost 10 times its budget. Maybe not quite that, but you know, it did quite well in terms of that. It also, of course, didn't get any nominations for the Academy Awards. Not that surprising.
Not unsurprisingly, yeah. I mean, it is also the year of the Exorcist and Day of the Dolphin, so you know it had stiff
competition. Yeah, for sure. The only sort of awards and nominations that it got were mostly for like genre film and genre fiction awards. Right. Probably because of the Michael Crichton connection would be my thought. Right. Is just that like people are already aware of who he is in that world. So yeah, didn't really get a lot of accolades in that way. But I would say that like most of the reviews at the time seemed to be quite positive for the most part.
Okay.
Variety said, Westworld is an excellent film which combines solid entertainment, chilling topicality, and superbly intelligent serio-comic story values. Michael Crichton's original script is as superior as his direction.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go.
Might be overselling it a little bit.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't know that I agree, but fair enough.
Yeah. Also, the serio-comic aspect as well is like, I don't know if the comedy totally lands. Yeah. You know, could have been left out or done differently. Later movies of his do a much better job of actually bringing the comedy into these topics. One review that was like a little bit more middling was from Vincent Canby at the New York Times. Always reliable, it seems like, for a middling review. He says, Crichton, the director, seems to have had more fun with the film than Crichton, the writer, whose screenplay can offer us no better explanation for the sudden bloody robot rebellion than an epidemic of central mechanical psychosis. This basic facetiousness is partly obscured by the vivid and sometimes amusing dimension of the film's anecdotes, which are mostly about the peril of the guests when make-believe gives way to reality.
Interesting.
So it's interesting to see the script being pegged as being weak in this movie when I feel like we're, for the most part, being like, actually, the script's probably the strong part and the rest is maybe where it sort of falls short. But it just does seem to have this staying power with people. Like, that's the thing that strikes me is just like, the Simpsons writers and all of these other filmmakers, especially your John Carpenters or your James Camerons, right, who are watching this movie and taking inspiration from it, like that says a lot to me. And then, of course, I mean, the thing that you have to say about this movie is that it also had a sequel movie. It had a sequel TV series in the 80s.
Oh, I didn't know about that.
Called Beyond Westworld.
Interesting.
In the early 2000s, Arnold Schwarzenegger was actually signed on to produce and star in a remake of this movie.
Of course he was.
Of course he was, which again, like, makes sense because it's kind of like coming full circle.
Yeah.
He played the Terminator. Terminator's based on Bryn, you know.
Yeah,
anyway,
yeah.
So he actually ended up dropping out of the project because he was elected the governor of California.
Thank goodness.
Right. And then,
well, I mean, maybe not for California, but, you know.
Well, yeah. And then you have, you know, the most recent remake. So, like, it has had this aftermath. It's almost a media franchise. I guess it is technically at this point.
Clearly, the premise has legs, you know. And
yes.
Did you watch the HBO series at all?
So I watched the first season and part of the second season, and then I think I stopped. I really enjoyed the first season, but then I didn't really love where it was going, I think was sort of where I landed with it.
Right. That's kind of what the general consensus of people I know who have watched it sort of said. I watched part of the first season, and I don't think I even finished it. It wasn't really my cup of tea. The crazy thing is that the show is run by Jonathan Nolan, Christopher Nolan's brother, who wrote a bunch of my favorite movies. So, like, in theory, I should like this thing. Just didn't do anything for me. But it's and the premise is a little too different for me. Like, I don't know.
I think it falls into the trap. We were talking about this, I can't remember in what episode, but it falls into the trap of a lot of these remakes and reboots and all this stuff of where they're like, well, we have to explain why this is the way it is.
It's the Prometheus problem.
And, the Prometheus problem, among other examples. I mean, I think Prometheus is a more interesting example of this in some ways, but like it happens in all sorts of little ways in movies where you're just like fleshing out background characters that like you're like, why you don't need to do that, right?
I don't need to know why Willy Wonka became a chocolatier. That's not of interest to me.
Hey, supposedly that movie is very good.
Yes, I've heard nothing but good things about that movie, but still, it doesn't mean that it needs to exist.
Point taken. Point
But
taken.
yes,
And so like it does kind of fall into that a little bit, where it's like, you know, like you said, one of the strengths of this movie is that it sort of sketches out the rest of the world, but it doesn't explain every detail. It doesn't give every character a huge backstory and, you know, a guilt-ridden past that ties into the present story and all this sort of stuff. These are just some guys who, like, are on vacation and survive a horrible massacre, right? Or one of them does. And the robots just go haywire because we don't understand how they work.
Yeah.
There's no sort of, like, greater philosophical thing in this movie. And even, like, you know, the original Jurassic Park has a little bit more, but just enough to kind of make you think, but like really not overburden it. And I do feel like the Westworld show, the most recent one, kind of got really into all of the sort of philosophical stuff and was really dwelling on all of it, and also was withholding so much information from you that also got a little grating after a while. So anyway, I watched the whole first season. I generally enjoyed it, but it's a very different philosophy of storytelling than this movie.
Totally.
So Adam, do the strengths outweigh the weaknesses for you on this one? It feels like it's a horse race.
Yeah, I mean, going into this record, I was really not sure what I was going to even say, because I was like, well, I don't love this movie, but I also don't hate this movie. And I think discussing it now, I'm more warm to it than I think I initially thought I was. I think there's some really interesting ideas here. I think the premise is really interesting. I think it's let down by the fact that I don't think Crichton's filmmaking chops are capable of doing this, and there is a part of me that wonders, like, oh man, if this movie had been made by a different filmmaker, or even made like 20 years later by a different filmmaker, like I keep being like, imagine like a David Fincher version of this movie, like a real visualist filmmaker who can take like these sort of heavy premises and like, or like even like Ridley Scott, or like just for me,
I like Friedkin. I think Friedkin would be.
I think a Friedkin version of this would be really super interesting. Like of that era, like if you kept it in the same like, filmmakers of the era. Premise-wise, it's there. It's just where it falls apart for me is it's just like visually and stylistically it's lacking. So
Yeah.
but I think, like you said, it's interesting to watch because you can sort of see the influence it has had over the course of the subsequent 5 decades. And in a weird way, it reminds me of like Jodorowsky's Dune that never got made.
Yeah.
And how like that ended up influencing Alien and Star Wars and like all these other movies take ideas from that and do it better. And I think like this is one of those movies where it's like people obviously saw it and were intrigued and were like, oh, how can I rework that into a more interesting or a more different idea? So I think it is worth seeing from that standpoint alone. And like, again, it's only 90-ish minutes. So it's not like it's a huge time commitment. It was never a slog like, you know, Planet of the Apes was for me. There's something here. And while I maybe wish it were better, there's enough there for me to say that, yes, I think the strengths outweigh the weaknesses, and I would recommend it. And I think it's also just fascinating from a standpoint of, like, it was so ahead of its time in that it was one of these science fiction things that had something to say, and maybe it didn't go quite into the ethics and morality like he eventually would in his other work. But this is very much a kind of film that we make nowadays. Maybe less so today, but, like, 10 years ago, maybe.
In the 90s and 2000s, this was like the thing.
Yeah, exactly. So it's just sort of this interesting artifact from that era, but I think it holds up a lot better than its other contemporary. Like you talk about all those sci-fi movies from around the same era, and I don't know that they hold up as well as this does. So
they're very different. Yeah, like Silent Running is like so slow. I mean, it's so an incredible. I love it, but it is so slow.
Yeah, but even like Logan's Run, like that's a perfect example. Like that is a kind of a schlocky, cheesy,
it's cheesy
sci-fi.
I love it
Whereas,
too, but it's cheesy.
Yeah, but this is like I wouldn't describe this movie as cheesy. Like it's
no, me neither.
It's cheap maybe, but it's effective. So I got to give it credit for that. How about you? I mean, you had seen it before. Like, did it hold up for you? Would you say the strengths outweigh the weaknesses?
Yeah, I mean, I think you nailed it. If you're interested in film history, sci-fi or horror or slashers or like any of the sort of genre world in a lot of ways, I think this movie is a really interesting watch because it does have such a wide influence, and you'll recognize Halloween in it, all of that. If you know that going in, you're going to be like, wow, holy crap, this existed like so many years before that. And on top of that, it's not like doing your homework. It's a fast watch. It's pretty entertaining. Like, it's not incredible. It's not life-changing watch, but I think it's so historically interesting and such an easy watch that like you should do it. You should check it out because it's just fascinating.
Yeah, the whole premise of our show is like I saw this movie and I'm like, oh, that's where that Simpsons reference comes from. And for me, this movie is less, oh, that's where that Simpsons reference come from. And it's more like, oh, that's where this thing from Blade Runner or this thing from Terminator or this, like there's so many elements from it that end up showing up in all sorts of things that it's kind of the perfect fit for our show. So
totally. So Adam, what about extra credit? Are there other movies that you might recommend that have a similar feel or a connection to this movie?
I mean, to be honest, I struggled with this because like I'm not a big sci-fi kind of guy. So beyond the sort of like all these films that we've touched on that were inspired by it, be it, you know, Terminator, although I don't particularly like the first Terminator movie, so again, I wouldn't necessarily recommend that. But like Blade Runner obviously is a classic, and if you haven't seen Blade Runner, that, you know, go and see that. Again, I don't have a ton of love for that movie because it's just not my cup of tea. Though I really.
What about Halloween?
Well, like Halloween is kind of interesting. You touched on Black Christmas, which I actually rewatched this holiday season, which is I think it's such an underrated and like it's a bizarre movie and Canadian. So like
Canadian,
So I have to love it, I think, by Canadian law. But honestly, like the thing that I would suggest people see is like check out The Last of Sheila. See this other Richard Benjamin movie. He's got a great mustache.
If you want more stick-on mustaches, then you know that's your game.
Yeah, it's a good movie. It nothing like this, but I do really enjoy it. So that would be my suggestion. What about you? You I think will have much better suggestions than I do.
So I had the opposite problem of like there were so many movies that came to mind for me because this is actually probably one of my favorite subgenres of science fiction even, which is like, you know, sci-fi corporations in a mundane world. right? Like I've already mentioned like some of the movies that like sort of fit into that genre. Like even Being John Malkovich is a great example of that, where it's like it's the world we all live in, except there's this corporation that has a secret hole into the brain of John Malkovich, right? Like, you know, it's stuff like that I really like, or Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, right? Like Charlie Kaufman writes a lot of stuff like that. But one of the movies we haven't talked about yet that I think is a great example of this subgenre is Total Recall. Have you ever seen Total Recall?
I saw Total Recall much too young, and of course remembered the one thing that every under 10-year-old boy remembers from Total Recall, and that was I remembered that, and then like him holding the head and it exploding. So I think it was last year I went back and finally revisited it along with a number of other Verhoeven movies. It is a wild movie, but it is very good. It is very, very, very good. And it's one of the Verhoeven movies I think actually holds up. Some of I think it's you who
I love Verhoeven.
You love Starship Troopers, right?
Starship Troopers is hilarious.
Yeah, I hated Starship Troopers, but really enjoyed Total Recall. So
I think the thing about Starship Troopers, I mean, this is a bit of a tangent, but it's like name dropped on The Simpsons in a title, I think, but it's not really ever parody.
Yeah.
So we're not going to get to talk about it on the podcast, really. I think the thing about it is that it's like once you get the joke of what it's doing. For some people, they're probably like, okay, I get it. I could turn this off now.
That's me. Right? It's like, to be honest, I don't think I finished the movie because I was just like, I get it. Like, I'm good.
Yeah.
Like,
I love it. I think it's hilarious, and it's a pretty visually interesting movie. I forgot, to be honest, that Total Recall was also Verhoeven. Total Recall, of course, like the other connection point is that the whole plot is based around this technology that you can use to immersively escape from your everyday life, right?
Yep.
So he's going to have a vacation on Mars where he's a secret agent, and then the question is like, is it real or is it not? And at the end, it's kind of like, I have no idea, and does it matter? So anyway, I love those movies and would highly, highly recommend them, as well as this movie.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode, but be sure to tune in next time where we'll be covering one of my all-time favorite movies, and I am very, very excited to have to revisit this one. It's the opposite of homework for me, but we will be talking about This Is Spinal Tap with special guest Marko Djurdjic. So you definitely want to come back for that because we are definitely turning things up to 11, and you'll get to hear me do so many bad Spinal Tap impressions throughout the show. It's going to be a blast. But until then, thank you so much for joining us for another episode of the Springfield Googleplex, the movie podcast for Simpson fans. If you enjoyed what you heard, please leave us a review and share this episode with Simpson fans and film buffs in your life. And until next time, Nate,
we'll see you around the Plex.
We'll see you around the Plex. Oh, and Nate is frozen, and he's frozen in the most adorable pose, so I can't actually hear if he is saying anything right now. So I'm just gonna send him a little text message. Oh, he lost power. Okay, that'll definitely do it. So now I'm just gonna riff while we wait for Nate to come back. Hopefully he comes back. And I'm gonna eat goldfish. Nate's gonna have to listen to me chew goldfish on mic when he edits this episode a little bit. La 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 la. Yeah, Last of Sheila, great movie. Highly recommend that one. If you like murder mysteries, which who doesn't love a good murder mystery? I know I do. Now I'm gonna have a little chocolate because it's New Year's. I got chocolate kicking around. So la la la. And connecting.
All right.
Oh, okay.
Can you hear me?
Back. I can hear you.
Yeah.
Okay, so we were just dunking on Richard Benjamin, James
Richard
Brolin.
Benjamin.